Welcome to It Starts With Courage podcast with Kat and Jen. What is it? It's everything. Everything you want in life starts with courage.
And we're back. Okay, so we already know I know what we're talking about today because this is a continuation of the episode that we had
randomness.
Started. Yeah.
We started and we shifted courses in the middle of it.
We started, yes. And I guess this is kind of not intertwined, but I realized that our last two episodes kind of come into this for me. I remember last year we did a podcast we're getting into holiday season now. And we did a podcast on when the holidays hurt. Oh. And recently, as I was mentioning last episode, I've been listening to Anderson Cooper's podcast, All There Is with Anderson Cooper. Why am I never good at titles? I never remember things about...
All There Is to Know About Anderson Cooper.
Something like that. And basically, Anderson Cooper's mother passed away 3 years ago. He's finally, for the first time, going through his mother's apartment, finding notes that she left of things that were important to her. And just to give a bit of a background on this, Anderson wants to discuss grief. And he interviews different people who have been through grief, have lost people. And for Anderson himself, he lost his dad when he was like 10, and then his brother committed suicide when he was 21. And for me, I'm someone who, this podcast is all about one poignant. Is it poignant? Poignant. What's the word? That they reiterate in
one point.
Poignant, like that, like poignant, it stands out. Guys, English is just Englishing. But anyway, it's basically how, and I never thought about it like this, that at some point in our lives, whether you've been through it yet or not, grief is one of the most common things amongst us all, but it's the loneliest thing ever. Because it's hard to talk about grief. When someone loses somebody, it's hard to know what to say to them.
Yeah.
Especially if you've never lost somebody. And for me, I lost my parents when I was young. I was 7 or 8. And as I've been listening to this podcast, it's really helped me have, and I can't imagine, number one, Jen, I don't mind if you're completely quiet in this podcast because I can't imagine. Grief is one of those things that silences a room. Nobody ever knows what to say because you don't know the right thing to say.
And nothing you can say can make it better.
Yes. Nothing you can say can make it better. And as I'm listening to this podcast, it just, number one, it's encouraging people to talk about grief a little bit more. And I want to frame it in this way. He basically, Anderson's, he's gay. And they've had some children, I think, through a surrogate person. And Anderson, when his dad passed away, his dad was 50 when his father passed away. And Anderson had kids after 50 because he said all throughout his life, he's never seen his life past the age of 50. So he could never imagine himself having kids because when his father passed away at the age of 10, he's never imagined what it's like to have, obviously, I mean, he never had a father after the age of 10. So certain life events that take place in your life, you can't imagine that. And he couldn't see that with his own children. So he sort of said, in a way, I just waited to die at 50, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And I say this to say, I was 7. It made me think of a situation. I hope even if my siblings listen to this, I
You're
hope
being vulnerable here.
Yes. So I passed away. No, I didn't pass away. I'm still here. When my parents passed away, I was, between 7, 8. So whenever I hear about grief, when somebody loses somebody, I am the worst person to talk to about it because I can't I can't relate to someone who's not a child losing a parent, which is a terrible thing. Because I don't feel not that I don't feel bad for you, but I just can't relate. I don't know the experience because in my eyes, I'm looking at it. Wow, you had your parent for this many years.
30 years or 40
Yeah,
years.
you've had this time, but obviously that's not how this person looks at it. And I remember as I grew up, obviously my siblings raised me. And when I came to America, as all my siblings have had children and they reached the ages of 7, 8, 9, when I lost my parents, I found that at some points I used to be jealous of children, right? To say when children are just being children, that is acting like children. And I remember saying to my nephew, my mom was dead by this age. You can't do that to your parents. But when I think about it, it's not the thing to say because number one, they can't relate. But at the same time, they don't know how to relate to you because outside of that, I've never spoken about my parents. I don't discuss my parents in a happy way. I used to do this with my parents and they don't know anything about my parents except that
they died when you were young.
they were died when I was young. They died when I was your age. So stop this behavior. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And Anderson in his podcast said, the reason I didn't want to have children is because growing up with my mother, I grew up with a grieving parent. I didn't grow up with my mother. I grew up with my grieving parent because all her grief, while she'd never discussed her feelings about what happened with her son, the children experienced a grieving mother. And this really had me thinking, it really is important to talk openly about grief to your children, to people around you, at least so that people understand you more and can relate when certain things get to you. For example, for me, getting close to the holidays or getting into the Decembers, because these are my months where things happened, can be quite difficult. And as we spoke about personal energy, my personal energy changes, even though I still try and be this happy person, but I know my personal energy changes. But one thing I realize is if you never talk about it, people don't know that.
Right.
And people can't support you. And people can take it personally when you start to behave a certain way. You start to, things just changed. I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but like I have so many things to say because I really feel like this is the first time I started addressing grief. And I don't think I've ever grieved yet, if I'm being honest. I don't think I've gotten to that point to grieve. I remember my brother, I think one of my oldest brothers is great at this. He is very open with his feelings. When he feels something, he is very open about it and he talks about it. And in Anderson Cooper's podcast, he interviews this guy who lost his brother and father in a car crash when he was 10 or something like that. And when they died, there's a belt that used to belong to his brother who died. And he's carried this belt with him to every single house that he has moved. Never worn it, but just hung it up. And as he's had children, he's spoken to his children about who his brother was and what, just about his brother in general, in happy terms, in ways how it affected
fun
him.
Stories,
yeah,
things
not
like
even
that.
fun, but everything about it. So one day his daughter walks into his room and sees this belt hanging. And the child is like, Dad, whose belt is that? Like, that belt is just always there. It's always hanging. And he says to the daughter, it's my brother's belt. And at that moment, his daughter just started crying. But she started crying because she was grieving for him, to say, you've told me these amazing things about
Yeah.
this person. I understand what this belt
Means
to you. So I think there was a time when my sister-in-law was telling me this, that I suppose when my brother speaks about, he talks to his children about everything, feelings, like our parents passing, all of that. And mind you, amongst my siblings, we don't talk about it. Nobody talks about it. And then once he told my young niece, she would have been maybe at my age, that, Auntie Catherine was your age when our parents died. And I remember my sister-in-law telling me how they were so distraught and just crying for me.
Yeah.
Which is just
because they put themselves in your shoes and they imagined their life without their parents at their age.
Yes. And recently, as I've been going home for the holidays, and my older sister, who is the one who raised me, I feel like maybe now we're at a time in our life where we started to talk about, not to talk about grief, but to actually talk about my parents, who they were, because I've become more curious, because from the age of 8 up until like now, all I know is pictures and things that I know, just because it's so difficult for us to talk about. And when I'm learning so much about who they actually were, just like I told the story of finding out my dad was a PE teacher. And, and now that I'm a little bit older than how old my oldest sister would have been when my parents passed away, and she now had these 7 siblings to basically lead. And I just imagine, even though you're grieving, you forget about the grief that somebody else has to go through, and the burden that I imagine that she had to bear all these years, or she had to put aside her own grief in order to look after this family, And so, yeah, it's, I don't know where this is going, but I just wanted to say grief is difficult. Grief is something that unites us in a crazy way, a lonely way, but everybody grieves in their own time. But I think I would like to encourage you, based on the story that Anderson Cooper told when he said, I was raised by a grieving parent. As hard as it is, in a way, I want to encourage you to not be overcome by grief. I know so many people who've lost people this year, and it is the most difficult time. And it's a time where sometimes I know some people feel like they can't cry because it's going to make other people uncomfortable. So if you know someone that's grieving, give them that space. Let them know that it's okay. You don't have to say anything. There's nothing, even if you've lost somebody, there's nothing that I can say to somebody else who has lost a parent at that time that will make it better. There's nothing that can be said. But you can be there with them in that moment. Yeah. As long as we make it okay we tend to push away people who are grieving and say, take your time. You may check in on them once in a while, but that's what makes it lonely.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I put you in a tough one there.
No, I enjoy listening to your point of view, and I think you have a unique experience. And I haven't experienced like the close loss of a parent or
Mm.
anything yet. But I have a friend that has like gone through
A lot.
a lot.
Mm.
And over the last 12 to 18 months, and seeing her just go through grief, and just, trying to go to lunch with her, and her just like breaking down and just apologizing for
Yeah.
crying. And I'm like, you don't have to
Yeah.
apologize, like there's nothing that I can say to make it better, but you're not making
Mm.
me uncomfortable by
Yeah.
like showing your
Your emotions.
emotions.
Yeah.
And so I think, there's a lot of people that are in the situations that you talked about, and
Mm.
I think it's some good advice that you gave.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's something we all go through.
Yeah.
And one thing about grief is I don't think it ever goes away. It just changes. It just changes, and that's okay. That's okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of It Starts With Courage podcast with Kat and Jen. If you like this episode of the podcast, visit our website, iswcpodcast.com, for show notes and other cool things.